Good morning, everybody. I'm Terence Corrigan, Project and Publications Manager at the Institute of Race Relations, here to introduce a document which we believe will help to frame some of the conversations South Africa is having around its economic path. It's not too much of a stretch to say that the economic fate of South Africa is the fate upon which the very future of our democracy turns. We are sitting with an unemployment problem of utterly catastrophic proportions, and this is not new. This is something that has dogged South Africa since the 1990s and has been the great issue that the post-apartheid order has not been able to address. Recently, we've also seen a fall off in investment. We've seen growth stalling. South Africa, once a fairly attractive investment destination in the emerging market space, is increasingly finding itself shifted to the periphery. Something has to change. And we at the Institute of Race Relations have since 1929 been focused on evidence-based solutions. With that in mind, we have produced a document very simply titled the IRR Growth Strategy. Nothing complicated there, because this is an issue that requires a very direct approach. And to introduce it, I am joined today by Dr. John Endres, our CEO, and he will be walking us through this, after which we will be happy to take questions. So without further ado, let me hand over to John. And John, what is this, and what does it say about South Africa's future?
Cool. Thanks, Terence. Thanks for the intro. I'd just like to check that you can hear me. Okay. I'm assuming that everybody can hear me. So I'd like to greet you all. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us today. And indeed, as Terence has set out, the topic today is growth, what we can do about South Africa's unemployment problem and its economic problem, which is becoming graver by the day. And over the past decade and a half, clearly we haven't had enough growth in South Africa. And the question is, what do we need to do to get more growth over the coming decade or two? And why does this matter? So we'll start off by just giving a bit of a scene setter of where we find ourselves at the moment in South Africa. We'll then get into the solution, which is that we do need some growth. How much do we need? We'll talk about that. And then we'll get into how to get that growth, which is based in our plan on 4 areas of activity: getting investment up, improving our infrastructure, changing the rules so that more people can get into the job market, and finally also just increasing the space for economic participation. And most of these changes, as we wrote in our full paper, would actually cost very little to implement. So they're not terribly expensive, but would have a very significant impact. We'll start out first with a view from the government, as we put it here, and more specifically a citation, a quote from the Green Paper on Social Security and Pension Reform that was published in 2021, where we find this following really amazing passage. The expectation that this group, and here the authors are referring to people without income, but who also don't qualify to receive social grants, that those people would derive their income primarily from selling their labor, has proven to be ineffective in the context of persistent, long-term, and structural unemployment. So why is this so special, this statement? Because what it effectively means, it signifies the government throwing its hands up in the air and saying, we give up. The statement is founded on the sentiment that South Africa's 32% unemployment rate is here to stay, and the best that we can do, or that the state can do, is to themselves money just to keep them alive. And the same kind of sentiment also motivates much of the discussion around the basic income grant. Now, as I say that, I want to emphasize that I do not dismiss the importance of South Africa's social grant system. It really helps to alleviate a lot of suffering, a lot of the pain of poverty. And so social grants do have to be kept in place while South Africa's economy remains as fragile as it currently is. But what I take issue with, and what makes my blood boil is the notion that this is the best that we can do, because I think it is not. So the kind of situation that we're facing at the moment is one which is sort of defined by these really defensive and also unimaginative policies around supporting huge swathes of the population. But what really matters about our current situation is that we are stuck in a sub 1% economic growth situation with unemployment above 30%. And the response from the government, of course, has been to build the developing world's largest social security system. But the thing is that in a stagnant or shrinking economy, we simply won't be able to generate the resources necessary to keep funding this system, a system that covers half the population, much less also finance all other government activities. So that's the problem. You've got very low growth, very high unemployment, a very large social security system, but one that is going to become very difficult to sustain if the economy doesn't grow. Just getting into some of the stats on the unemployment, we've got 8 million unemployed South Africans on the narrow definition, so it doesn't include people who've given up looking for work. This is 8 million people who are looking for work but can't get it. 4 out of 5 of those unemployed people have been unemployed for longer than a year. And of course, as you can imagine, the longer you are without a job for, the more difficult it becomes to find your way back into the labor market. So it means that these 8 million people, plus the discouraged job seekers, are effectively dependent on others for their income, be it family members or be it the state. But really, these aren't great prospects. So this is a world of grey misery, really, where ordinary South Africans are dependent either on the charity of their family members or on the whim and vagaries of the government for their income. And this experience isn't a great one. So if you think about the SATA experience, just think of these long queues when people are waiting to collect their grants. Think of the hours and hours spent waiting in the sun to get your turn at the counter to get your small grant. Or think back also to the panic that is triggered every time that there's a disruption or an interruption in the SASSA payouts. You can also think back a little bit further to 2021, when we had Minister Lindiwe Sisulu exhorting people queuing for their social grants to socially distance, even while the people were being sprayed with a water cannon by the police. So this SASSA experience, as much good as the grants do, it is not a very edifying spectacle. It's probably also not a very dignifying spectacle. And for that reason, what we suggest is that we really need to find a way to grow the economy and create jobs so that people have more options and more prospects. And our sense is that the government is not really thinking about how to achieve that. Instead, what we see is President Ramaphosa heralding grants as one of the government's greatest achievements. He also said in that same text that they support economic growth and job creation. But as we saw on an earlier slide, economic growth is below 1%. Unemployment is about 30%. So if these social grants are working in that sense, they're certainly not working very well. Ultimately, I think the honest view is that social grants should not be seen as a great achievement. They are an admission of defeat. And to use a medical analogy, they are like a doctor giving morphine to a dying patient just to ease the suffering. But the terrible thing in this situation is that it's actually the doctor who's causing the patient to die. And that is through bad policies that are leading to the kind of low growth environment that we've got and these very high levels of unemployment. Just to illustrate the scale of the social grants and social grant dependency in South Africa, we have fully half of South Africa's households receive grants. So that's 50% of households get at least one form of grant. And almost a quarter, 24%, rely on social grants as their main source of income. And that is absolutely flabbergasting. We've got 3 provinces as well, which are the ANC strongholds of Mpumalanga, Limpopo, and Eastern Cape, where 2/3 of households receive at least one social grant. So how did we get into this situation? Well, we've been stuck in a low growth rate for about the past 15 years or so. Our average has been 1.2% GDP growth since 2008, and our GDP per capita has actually declined by 3,000 Rand over the same period. South Africans are really feeling this. Money is becoming tighter, jobs are becoming scarcer, and everybody is feeling quite frustrated and gloomy about the country's prospects. So you get the sense of declinism setting in, and also you get the sense that the nation is losing its self-belief. And that is something that does need to be turned around. So what can be done about it? Well, we're not going to really turn it around with more grants or with pretend jobs created by the government. We're actually going to need proper jobs, real jobs. And the way to generate those is through real economic growth. So you need companies being created, or existing companies hiring more people as they need to support their expansion. And this is what needs to happen, but it feels like the ANC government at the moment is not even thinking about how to make this happen. So the IRR last week made a submission to the multi-party charter parties at their gathering on 16 and 17 August, making a proposal on how to get the growth that is going to lead to the job creation that we need in South Africa. And as you ask that question, of course, you have to ask, how much growth do you need? And we are setting a number, and that number is 7%. And you might respond now, quite appropriately, that is vastly ambitious. And what is the IRR going on about? 7%. Can't really imagine that happening under current circumstances. But there's a reason behind the madness. The reason that we posit such an ambitious goal is twofold. The first is that in our current dire circumstances, we really need a fundamental shift in our mindsets. So tinkering around the edges, as we are doing at the moment, is no longer good enough. We're not going to get really proper growth by fiddling with spectrum release and visa reform, as Operation Vulindlela does. That's just not going to do it. The changes we need now are going to have to be more fundamental, and that is what we'll describe in this briefing. The second reason that we need these really ambitious targets, like a 7% growth rate, is that it is an honest reflection of the scale of our challenges. So if we want to get our unemployment rate down from 32.6%, where it is at the moment, to single-digit levels in a decade, there's actually no way to do that unless you get the economy growing at 7%. And even then, it's still a stretch. And finally, of course, also, the longer we wait to get going on this and try to move towards this high growth rate, the more years of poverty and state dependency we are condemning millions of South Africans to, plus also that if we miss a 7% target by percentage point or two, that's still vastly better than being stuck as we are at the moment at this 1% level. So 7%, that's what we're going to propose. And why that number matters, why it's useful, is that if you think about growth rates, if you divide the number 70 by the growth rate percent, it tells you how many years it will take to double the size of the economy. So if you divide 70 by 7% growth rate, it means the economy will be twice as large in 10 years. If the growth rate is 5%, it'll take 14 years. If it's 3.5%, it'll take 20 years. That was our average between 1994 and 2007. But if we're at 1% growth, you divide the 70 by 1, it means 70 years before the economy doubles. And that is something we really shouldn't accept as a nation. So, how do we get there? How can we get to 7% growth? Well, we give you 4 components, as mentioned before. And the first one is going to be the question of investment. How do we get to higher investment levels? So the current situation is, it's just a sort of emblematic statistic that is worth tracking, is something called the gross fixed capital formation rate. And that expresses in percent as a share of GDP, how much money is being invested by business people into things like factories and heavy machinery and equipment and infrastructure. So it's a really permanent type of investment, very different to investments in financial markets, where you can put the money in quickly, you can take it out quickly. If you're investing into fixed capital, that money is going to be there for a while. So investors who put money into fixed capital, they take a longer term view because they are taking a bet that leaving their money in one place for a longer time is going to pay off for them in the form of handsome returns. And where we are at the moment in South Africa is on a declining trend. Since 2008, when we were at a peak of 21.6% gross fixed capital formation, this has declined down to 13% in 2021. It recovered a little bit last year to 14.2%, but that's still far off where we want to be. The National Development Plan published by the government in 2012, called for a rate of 30%. So that's very clear that we're far from that. The reason this kind of investment matters for a country like South Africa is that it signifies a vote of confidence in the investment environment. It creates jobs, and it also gives you the factories and equipment you need to make products, as well as the infrastructure to get those products to market. On all of these scores, South Africa is currently failing, and you can ignore the song and dance about the president's annual investment jamborees, because in reality, many of the companies we speak to on a regular basis tell us that they are keen to invest outside of South Africa, or they've already done so. Many large South African companies have listed on overseas stock exchanges, and most wealthy people in South Africa have already made sure that most of their assets are safely offshore. So if you want to turn this around, you have to think in a really focused way about how to make investors want to put their money in South Africa instead of taking it out. This includes both local and foreign investors, both of whom are currently reluctant to put their money in South Africa or leave it there for various reasons, but this is something that can be addressed. So how do we boost investment? Well, let's start with the simplest of all observations. You've got to remove the threats to property rights. Investors don't like investing in environments where their property isn't safe. In South Africa, the most obvious threat is a government that is at best ambivalent about property rights. And we've tracked a whole plethora of existing or planned threats to property rights. And at the moment, the most prominent of those is expropriation without compensation, or EWC. This hasn't been made law yet, but the ANC is really pursuing it with great determination through the expropriation bill, which is currently before the upper house of parliament, that is the National Council of Provinces. So something like EWC is not the kind of policy that's going to make investors feel comfortable putting their money into South Africa on a long-term basis. And that means that a government that wants to spark economic growth in South Africa has to abandon EWC and also other challenges to property rights. So EWC has to be scrapped, as well as threats to intellectual property rights, pensions, healthcare, and other private property, if South Africa is going to have any chance of attracting the investment that it needs to ignite growth. The second point is also kind of obvious, which is that you need to address the crime problem. And in South Africa, of course, as individuals, as companies, we have to fear losing our property or even our lives to criminals who have no respect for other people's property and are also not really very afraid of being caught, prosecuted, sentenced, or punished. So what we need is for business people and ordinary South Africans to feel that they won't be mugged walking down the street and that their possessions won't be taken from them under the threat of violence. How do you do this? Well, there's a few things you can do. You can end the policy of cadre deployment, which is the ANC stated and defended policy. You've got to depoliticize the police. You've got to assert the independence of the National Prosecuting Authority and the Hawks. And you can also, of course, second managers from the private sector to the national and provincial police headquarters, as well as other law enforcement agencies like the Hawks, the IPID, the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, or the NPA. All appointments or promotions that these organizations make should be made on merit and should be built on a solid foundation of entrance and advancement examinations. Next, you've got to create a competitive investment climate. What does that mean? Well, simply it means that you have to make it a lot more easy to do business in South Africa. It means improving the infrastructure, which we'll get to just now, but you also have to make government bureaucracy a lot more transparent and efficient, simplify the labor laws, scrap the BEE edifice that serves as a smokescreen for so much corruption and price inflation. And in doing this, South Africa can draw on the inspiration from other countries that transitioned onto high-speed growth trajectories, including China under Deng, India in the 1990s under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, and Finance Minister Singh. So this is a really well-trodden path, and South Africa should follow in the footsteps of other countries that have walked it in the past. The fourth thing we should do to boost investment is to create an entrepreneur-friendly economic climate. It means encouraging all forms of business activities rather than trying to pick winners and plan for success in the form of as we have them at the moment, top-down industrial policy action plans, sectoral master plans, and black industrialist programs. These plans really produce persistent distortions in markets and are hugely expensive to boot. New technologies and markets are always evolving, and we really can't know what tomorrow's successful sectors are going to be. So really, you should leave business people to make those calls and also take the risk of failing or the opportunity of succeeding, of course. Some things you can do to make the environment more entrepreneur-friendly would be to improve access to finance on a commercial basis, however, improve financial literacy, provide business training, and encourage innovation. Should make it really easy for businesses of all sizes to sell their products abroad, because for many companies, the South African market is too small. There's not enough demand in the local market to really sustain growing and large businesses. So you need to tap into overseas markets. So you should remove exchange controls, make it easy to receive payments, to send money overseas, and just overall make it easier to access foreign markets. Would also encourage informal businesses to thrive, because what we're seeing at the moment is that government regulation often serves as a spur to market concentration, because larger players will be involved in writing the rules to suit themselves. They'll get a certain cost burden as a result of this, but often this eliminates smaller competitors. So you really want to reduce the regulation and open up the markets so all sorts of businesses can compete. In our paper, we also mention the concept of economic freedom. There are two prominent indices produced by the Heritage Foundation and the Fraser Institute, which just very clearly show that freer countries outperform those that are less free. That's across a range of indicators. South Africa's economic freedom rating has slipped, however, from 7.1 in the year 2000, when we ranked 47th in the world, down to 6.55 in 2020, and that is ranking 99th. So South Africa's economic growth has stalled just as its economic freedom has slipped, and that is something that we need to reverse. Okay, next step. After you've taken the steps to boost investment, you need to look at the infrastructure, of course, and our headline stat here is rather obvious. Let's look at electricity. This is the total electricity produced by Eskom per year in gigawatt hours. Start in 2008, when we were producing almost 250,000 gigawatt hours. That has slipped down to 208,000. And it's, of course, very obvious that a country that doesn't produce enough electricity for its current needs, and therefore has to load shed, cannot power economic expansion. So that is, of course, also true for all other forms of infrastructure in South Africa, ranging from roads to railways to ports and so on. Now, the South African government has been rather resistant to private sector involvement, never mind privatization in all of these areas. But its management of the state's infrastructure has been so disastrous that it is increasingly being left with no other option, if it wants to avoid the complete collapse of infrastructure. Nonetheless, short of privatization, there are some other ways in which you can bring in the private sector. So you can use various forms of private-public partnership that I won't go into detail here. They are described in the paper. But also, you should really still consider privatization and using those proceeds to pay down the government debt, which is reaching dangerously high levels. And I think that the words of the finance minister, who's meant to assure us that he's got it under control and debt is going to peak and then come down, I don't think that's going to happen. The way it's looking at the moment is that debt is going to continue going up. Right now, South Africa is already paying R1 billion every single day over the next 3 years to service its debts. And that's going to become an even bigger problem if the economy doesn't grow, if the finance minister isn't able to contain expenses, spending, and especially if revenue doesn't come up. So some form of income is going to be needed, and selling some SOEs would be a useful form of doing that. However, when you privatize, you must keep in mind, of course, some of the less positive experiences in the former communist world. So you need open and competitive processes to prevent corruption, cronyism, and also the emergence of new monopolies. that is going to be quite important to make this work. So we move on from infrastructure to jobs, which is where we started. We want to get millions more people into the job market so they're able to earn an income, progress up the career ladder, hopefully, and earn rising amounts. Our headline stat here is just the comparison between long-term and short-term unemployment. Going back to 2008 to the present, that is the second quarter of this year, we see the number of unemployed people that are long-term unemployed, marked in red, increasing over this period, as well as the short-term unemployed with less than a year spent out of employment. But the number is about 8 million in total, and the fact that so many South Africans have been without work for a year or longer is very concerning. It needs to be addressed, and if we're going to improve the state of South Africa, we are going to have to create massive numbers of jobs. How do we do it? Well, firstly, we should be aware that growth per se produces jobs. So when people dismiss this notion and talk about jobless growth in the mid-2000s, that actually wasn't true, because the economy grew at quite a decent level, around 5% for a 3-year period, and jobs were being produced and unemployment was coming down. So growth will create demand for jobs. It will produce jobs, and we should not ignore that fact. However, there's a bit more you can do. The first thing we should do here is to lower the barriers to entry for job seekers. At the moment, what we've got is a situation where business owners, companies are quite reluctant often to give young or inexperienced applicants or unskilled applicants a chance to prove themselves for various reasons. For example, entry-level wages are quite high, and so the companies just shrink back from giving people a chance. That is partly because of the extension of bargaining council agreements to non-parties. So you get large companies coming to a wage deal, which then gets enforced on smaller companies that weren't actually part of the negotiations. It means that they have to offer wages that maybe they cannot afford, so they don't offer jobs, and the job market becomes just a little bit stuck. So young, inexperienced, unskilled people can't get in. Same happens with the national minimum wage, which is set at a very high level in South Africa, comparable to the median wage, and that means that it's just setting a really high barrier for people to get that foothold in the job market. Also keep in mind that the very same government that has introduced these high national minimum wages does have an expanded public works program in which it pays people 110 Rand per day. So at least they're getting some income and some experience, but it's not quite clear why this should not be extended to the private sector, on the assumption that people who work for the private sector rather than the expanded public works program would benefit far more from the experience. So our call is to scrap the extension of bargaining council agreements to non-parties, also scrap the national minimum wage. We've got an unemployment rate over 30% on the narrow definition, and under those circumstances, really excluding people from being able to work is not a wise move. Should also reform the rules on hiring and firing, just give companies more flexibility, let them take a chance on people. If it doesn't work out, let them move on. But if it does, at least that person has got an entry point and the opportunity to progress as well. What we also need to do is improve business conditions for labor-intensive industries, especially because we have a very large labor pool that is untapped and often also unskilled. How do we get these people into the labor market? Well, you've got to look at your labor-intensive industries, like agriculture, for example, mining and tourism. And of course, there's some really obvious things you can do in all of those areas. Property rights, again, becomes relevant for agriculture. Agriculture in South Africa is very productive, also highly competitive, but it could become even more so if it were not under the threat of expropriation without compensation, as the farming community considers itself to be at the moment. In mining, South Africa has this really extraordinary mineral endowment valued at as much as $2.5 trillion, which we are not exploiting properly. And the reason for that is the policy environment. Exploration licenses, mining licenses are not being issued or hard to get. There's a lot of uncertainty in the whole system. The mining charters don't help. So that should really be deregulated, opened up, liberated, and then mining can get a huge boost, create lots of jobs, and also generate export revenues for South Africa. Tourism, another obvious example. There's plenty of more opportunities that we as a nation could use there. And one example would be specialized tourism. For example, medical tourism. Our medical services in the private sector are very, very good. By all means, let's get foreigners coming here for an operation or treatment, and then continue on to the Kruger Park and have a safari. You can have cultural, archaeological tourism. We've got some of the most amazing archaeological sites in South Africa. Those should be a major drawing point. Or photography tourism. There's so much to see in South Africa. At the same time, we shouldn't forget about skilled job creation. You're going to need lots of people with skills to help build the companies and create the opportunity for expansion in the economy and for more broadly job creation. And there, again, there are some really simple things you can do. Just make it a lot easier for skilled foreigners to come into South Africa by easing the visa and immigration procedures. Should also aggressively sell the lifestyle attractions of South Africa, its favorable exchange rate. We've got a lot going for us, and we should also encourage expatriate South Africans to return. They should invest their skills and capital here, and they should be able to make use of the opportunities offered by a rapidly expanding economy here in South Africa. We now come to the final part 4 of the growth strategy, and that is dealing with finding ways to broaden and speed up economic participation. Our headline stat is the labor absorption rate, and this is a statistic that measures as a share of the working age population how many people actually have a job. And in South Africa, that's around 40%. In other countries, that is around 65, 70, sometimes even up to 80%, which is where ours should be. But this chart just shows you how far we're falling short. Too many people in South Africa are just not involved in the labor market for lack of opportunity, and that is something that needs to change. We need to bring more people into the labor market. So, one of the reasons that we are at such a low level is because of the BEE policies, which are very ambitious, but as we've seen, they failed in their purpose, and even commentators who usually don't agree with us at the IRR are grudgingly beginning to admit and wonder if it's not time to reform BEE. And in fact, it very much is time to do so. Even Chief Justice Zondo, in his inquiry on state capture, found that affirmative action policies often serve as a smokescreen for very much corruption and price inflation. They deter investment, they hamper business operations, and that is really runs counter to this goal that we're setting of achieving 7% growth. So we need to do away with those things and do something far better. How do we broaden economic participation? Well, firstly, you replace BEE with EED, and EED stands for Economic Empowerment for the Disadvantaged. That is a concept developed here at the IRR, and we believe that that really could play a huge role in bringing lots more people into the job market and being a lot more successful. So this EED plan has the following components. Firstly, it says instead of giving companies BEE points, you recognize and reward them for supporting growth and expanding opportunity. So you want companies to do the thing that companies are good at, which is supporting economic growth and also creating jobs in support of that growth. So the kinds of activities that would be recognized if you're a company would be, for example, investing in South Africa, retaining or expanding, creating jobs, contributing to tax revenues, as well as export earnings and R&D spending, topping up venture capital funds, appointing staff on a wide definition of merit that also takes into account disadvantage, and also entering into effective public-private partnerships to improve education, healthcare, and housing, and also to maintain and expand. These should be recognized and rewarded for. It would mean replacing BEE and employment equity rules with EED, but we think this would win the sincere support of investors and the business community and would be far more effective in helping South Africans climb the ladder to economic success than current policies do. I'm just going to quote a little bit from our report here. We say there is an urgent need for this reform. Current employment equity and BEE policies are unable to help the disadvantaged, as our surveys show, and it is now widely recognized even by those sympathetic to the existing approach. Worse still, they are deterring investment, limiting growth, and adding to the unemployment crisis. These policies are therefore hurting rather than helping the victims of past racial discrimination. But nonetheless, these policies are currently being further ratcheted up, and that's causing great harm to the economy. Continuing with EED, it proposes to select its beneficiaries on a socioeconomic rather than a racial basis, sort of on the same kind of basis as the social grant system, which also does not rely on race to identify beneficiaries. The point here is that you want to empower the poor, whatever the right race might be. And in a nutshell, the concept is that you keep in place the existing cash grants for children, pensioners, and the disabled with some adjustments, but you really greatly improve the way in which education, healthcare, and housing are provided. And that brings us to that fourth point. So what you do to improve outcomes in these areas is that you introduce a voucher system. So what you want to do is leave responsibility for setting goals and for developing policies and for raising revenue with the government. So this is a tax-funded program. But you want to move the responsibility for delivery and implementation away from the government and to individuals, communities, and businesses. That is where these tax-funded vouchers come in. I'm going to quote here again from our paper just on education specifically. We've done extensive research on education vouchers, but the underlying idea can easily be extended to healthcare and housing. In education, the key concept is that government must continue to fund education out of tax revenues, but need no longer provide it. Instead, it should allow communities, NGOs, or private investors to take charge of failing public schools and provide new schools. Most of the education budget would be divided among pupils and distributed to their parents in the form of education vouchers, which could be used solely to pay for schooling. Parents would then be empowered to enroll their children at any school of their choice, and as fee-paying consumers, they would be able to hold school principals and teachers to account. Since schools would have to compete for the patronage of parents, this would give them a powerful incentive to upgrade their teaching and improve their overall performance. In short, what these vouchers will do is that they will generate a market for education. And this would bring about a rapid improvement in the quality of education, as has happened in other countries where vouchers have been introduced. The same concept, as noted, can be rolled out across healthcare and housing. We've polled on support for the vouchers, and we've found in our polls since 2016 really high level for the voucher system. And talking just about the Black respondents, the support is consistently in the range of 80 to 90%. So really, this is a very popular idea and one that should be introduced. So if we were to fix education, healthcare, and housing in this way, we would greatly enhance skills, improve living conditions, and also give people the power to get ahead in their lives. These types of interventions, we think, will be needed for many years, especially as wages will generally be low at the start of the turnaround process. But nonetheless, it's necessary to get started. And that brings us to the end of this briefing. And if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from this, it is this, that South Africa's slide can be halted and turned around, but you can't do it with small tweaks. It requires bold reforms which are inspired by the experience of other countries and should be underpinned by evidence-based policies. And with that, I welcome your questions.
Thank you, John. I would just like to sort of kick off things here by reading a comment from one of our attendees, Tabani in Kumalo, PhD. It will also reduce the escalation of crime which is caused by unemployment. And I think this is that actually encapsulates quite a bit that if we kind of accept on a more almost philosophical level that the purpose of governance and the purpose of an economy is the well-being and happiness and fulfillment of people, each measure of progress that we make helps to generate a positive knock-on effects. When we are failing, it generates precisely the opposite. And I think that too many South Africans now find themselves in a slough of despondency. People living in what are or have historically been low-income communities see these as places to escape from. Many of the more well-to-do in South Africa start to view the country as a place to escape from. We need to turn this around and look at South Africa not in terms of how we can get out of it, but how we can get out of our problems, how we can turn those low income communities into communities on the move, where nascent entrepreneurs can start to build things that will last, when investors want to come, where people don't have to spend 2 hours a day on a bus to find to go to a job at the other end of the city. And for those South Africans who worry about the future, the future of their children, they can see that the future doesn't have to be in London or in Sydney, but can be in Pofadder or Kakamas. In a globalized world, those opportunities can be built here. Now, it strikes me that pretty much everything that you've said, in many ways, is common sense. There could be a dispute here or there about the ideological approach. There could be maybe a disagreement about the practicability. But overall, I think there's a wide degree of consensus that something along the lines of what we're proposing has to be introduced. Why is it not being introduced? What's the holdup?
Well, I think there's really two reasons for that, Terence. And one of those would be the ideological reason, where I think that many of the things that we describe in this plan really are not in the worldview of the current government. The approach is very much one that sees the state as the great enabler, the intervenor in the economy, the a producer of goods and services for the people, and that sees the state at the center of everything. It's a very centralizing notion that actually disempowers ordinary people. And the approach we describe here does empower ordinary people. It says, it's actually up to us as individuals, as communities, to get things done. And if all of us are able to do this in a spirit of free exchange and free trade without coercion, the outcomes are going to be really good for the country. So this is the ideological side. The second side is the pragmatic side, where my sense is that there's no reform program that doesn't have winners and losers. And I think that many of the people in power at the moment are worried that they will be amongst the losers from reforms like this, which is probably true, because at the moment they are in the position of gatekeepers. They hold the power. They are able to call the shots. They are able to divert some income streams towards themselves. They're able to appropriate assets. They're in control. But if you decentralize power to ordinary people and to businesses, those in charge are going to lose some of their power. And I think the prospect of losing that kind of power is threatening, it's unpleasant, so you don't go down that route. In that sense, however, what I also find interesting is the idea that last week's multi-party charter party convention does have the opportunity to create this kind of binary opposition between two ideas. We'll say on the one side, you've got the ANC and also the EFF, which really buys into the notion of centralization and interventionism and a powerful state and all the things that we see here, which have been most remarkably summarized in a recent book by Anthea Jeffrey, our senior colleague. I encourage you to read that book. Versus on the other side, these opposition parties or reform parties, which are trying to figure out a way to have a different approach and say, well, this is what we've got at the moment has given us 8 million unemployed, 30% plus unemployment, sub 1% growth. How do we get away from that? So they can now position themselves as being the growth parties that want to get the country going and growing and get jobs being created, versus the ANC-EFF, which has showed what it is capable of, which is not very impressive, and therefore, it makes an argument to the voters to choose between two options, one of which is clearly more appealing than the other.
Okay. Question in the comments here. Many of these reforms will upset entrenched special interests. This will likely result in a backlash in the forms of strikes, riots, and other forms of violence. I think one could also talk about deliberate sabotage. I think that one of the great strategic risks that South Africa faces is an administration that has been both politicized and criminally penetrated. Um, which, I think that's something we're likely to have to wrestle with for a generation. Is it possible to overcome these forces, and how should the government respond, or how should a government respond to this?
Yeah, I think it is possible. So it's a good question and also a serious concern. But what we're seeing at the moment already, I think, is a weakening of the state, an emasculation of the state, and an increasing sidelining of the state on the part of private citizens, businesses, community organizations, which are sorting out things for themselves because the state is just not doing it.
Mm.
And I think that to introduce these kinds of reforms means continuing along the same path, where you sideline the vested interests, you park them in an office somewhere, um, leave them there, and just rebuild the entities that you need to see working. And ultimately, I do think that the power lies with ordinary citizens, with private business, with private initiative, rather than with the state. We've become very used to seeing the state at the center of everything. It's reflective of the mindset within the ruling party, but it doesn't have to be that way. The state,
Mm.
it can be far smaller, far less influential, far less powerful than it is now, and it can be placed in that position as well by being sidelined and not engaged with when it doesn't work properly, and that includes the vested interests as well. We
Correct.
saw
Yes.
the face down in Cape Town now between the mayor, Jordan Hill Lewis, and the taxis, where it was exactly what our viewer is describing here. Upsetting entrenched special interests, a backlash in the form of strikes, riots, and violence. Well, what did the mayor, what did the administration do? They said, well, we're not budgeting on this. You're going to follow the rules because
Mm.
rules is rules. And you can strike for as long as you like. You can be violent. We are not going to budge from this. And I think that is the kind of attitude you need. You need that sort of assertion of doing things the right way in order to introduce these reforms.
Right. I would add to that I think that there is a need for reformists. I mean, business people who
Mm,
want to shift off the fence. I mean, for activists, and I think actually there's a special role for those whom we might describe as more historically on the left, who are concerned about South Africa's future, to actually,
mm,
if nothing else, out of a sense of emergency, short-term pragmatism, to actually take these arguments to ordinary people. I remember about a decade ago there was a lot of talk in the ANC, mostly directed by the ANC Youth League, currently resurrected as the Economic Freedom Fighters, about nationalizing the mines. And I think that mining interests, came out and said, well, we've decided we're going to take action and speak to reasonable people in the ANC. We
mhm,
pointed out, well, why were they not taking these concerns to the actual, people whom to whom the pro-nationalization people were talking, to people in informal settlements, people who were unemployed, and for whom this was being marketed as the great silver bullet that would solve everything. I think this is something that the concept of the ivory tower can be one that holds people captive.
mhm.
Let me move on to another question. So, if we're talking about ideology, what we're saying is there needs to be some sort of attitudinal shift. Do I do I have that correct?
Yes, or a replacement of those who hold the current So I'm not sure if my connection just dropped.
Yeah. If you just repeat that.
Yeah, I would say that either it takes a shift in mindset or ideology, or a
Hmm.
replacement of those who will not shift their mindsets.
Right.
So in other words, you'll definitely come across some hidebound ideologues who will say, we observe the 30% plus unemployment, we observe the sub 1% growth, but we can't change from what we believe to be true. And ultimately, what needs to happen is that they either get sidelined or they get voted out of office, so that people with working with ideas that can work can take over.
Right. And I see we've got another comment. Job growth is not applicable anymore as mechanizing, automation, and robots are the future. No mention of family planning of only two. I think it's only 2 children per mother is not a. I think this means we haven't addressed that. So I think what you're talking about there, first of all, is the fourth industrial revolution, robotics, artificial intelligence, etc., and then demographics in terms of population growth and the impact of that.
Yeah. So I think, automation, artificial intelligence, mechanization, and robots are clearly advancing, and they are going to take over many jobs. But here's an interesting thought. If you're working as, I don't know, a copywriter, a translator, a researcher, a legal assistant, these kinds of jobs are probably going to be replaced by artificial intelligence at some stage. But if you are a plumber, a mechanic, a carpenter, an electrician, your job is probably safe from automation, from AI, and from mechanization. Because for all of these things, you need an actual person to go on site and to do specific work. So I think there's still quite a lot of jobs available in the future despite automation. The same also in tourism. I don't think you're going to get room servicing robots very soon, at least not ones that are more affordable than having a person do the job. And a lot of tourism is human to human interaction. A tour guide, you'd rather have a person explaining to you what you're seeing, going through a city or through a game park, than having just the audio recording, which of course is the way it's going in many overseas countries. So I think there's still lots of opportunity for job creation, even at an unskilled level. And I also think that we are seeing sort of a really sort of long-term massive shift happening at the moment, which is where manufacturing, which has shifted so dramatically to Asia and Southeast Asia, is going to have to shift again for the reason that labor costs are going up quite quickly in those countries, which have benefited from the rapid growth that we're trying to achieve here. But many of those people, owning those factories are going to say, it's getting a bit expensive here in Taiwan or even Malaysia, Indonesia. Where are we going to go next? And I think Africa is sort of an obvious place to go to because you've got a youthful population, you've got a growing population, you've got low wage costs. So if Africa and also South Africa play their cards right, there's lots of opportunities to benefit from here. And that also plays into the population growth argument. If you look at a bi-continent map of where populations are declining or growing, they are declining almost everywhere in the world except Africa. And this is going to become a very big problem for all of the world except Africa. You might be worried about overpopulation, as many people were a few decades ago. But I think that population decline is going to become an issue probably more serious than climate change. So, by 2100, you'll have 80% of the world population living in countries where most of the population is over the age of 60. There's not many children being born. There's very few workers available to do work. There's not going to be a lot of demand consumption either because older people have already satisfied most of their consumption needs. And Africa is going to be hugely important in that context. So I would say family planning, sure. I think not as much of a problem as we think, and also especially not in South Africa. So our population growth rate is actually not that high. It's around 1% or so. It's different in other parts of Africa, of course. But don't be too fixated on overpopulation. I think population decline is what we need to keep an eye on over the course of the next decades.
I think it's important in that respect to point out that China's one-child policy, which was seen, by many people who I would not regard as natural sort of China authoritarian sympathizers, but was seen as a sort of a major achievement of demographic management, has produced two very significant problems. Now, first of all, the massive imbalance and oversupply of men who cannot find partners, leading to all sorts of frustrations, but also the inverted population pyramid. The two of them working together. I mean, there's a comment that one sees, in the commentary not sure who it's originally attributed to, but China will get old before it gets rich. Which is why countries like, which is one reason, as well as, the prosperity, China's sort of becoming a victim of its own success, has become more prosperous, wage costs have risen. So there's been a sort of migration out into places like Vietnam and Indonesia, which have large populations, low wage workforces, and young workforces. But yes, I think that will depend very much on how it is managed. Another comment: if the millions of people who do not vote could be aware of the contents of this briefing, it would change South Africa. If only. How many times do we sit in meetings and say, well, if everyone just agreed with us, we'd be fine.
Yes, that would be quite lovely. I think that is, it's I think should serve as an impulse to us at the IRR to get this message out more widely, both in terms of the kinds of policies and reforms that we promote here, but also in terms of voting. So if we're going to have this play out the way it may do, ANC and EFF on the one side, and reform parties on the other side, low growth, high unemployment is your one choice, and high growth, low unemployment is your other choice.
Right.
Yeah, that could make a big difference. And I think organizations like us and other civil society organizations have a very important role here to play here in getting the message out and getting people to reflect their preferences in their votes.
Well, look, if I can just make an appeal to those who are watching and like what they hear. First of all, please do spread the word about it, about ourselves. Please consider signing up as a supporter of the IRR, and also please distribute our materials and whatever networks you have. I think that, as we've said, what we need to do is not just to talk about the policy or material changes, but also the attitudinal shifts. I'm sure that pretty much everyone watching this, has some close friend or family member who's either decamped or thinking about doing so. That is a very, very painful thing for many of us. This is a Ernest Hemingway said the world is a wonderful place and worth fighting for, and I think much the same can be said of South Africa. And this is not a forlorn battle. I think we're getting to the end of our time, but I'd like to get a response from you on one final point. There are opportunities for South Africa if it played its cards right. I was actually speaking on at an event last night about BRICS, and I was asked, well, what do I think about it? And I said, it's one of these things that could potentially have been worthwhile, but South Africa seems to be so caught up in its own ideological narratives that it misses these sort of the pragmatic opportunities. Now, opportunities for South Africa exist, but there are many severe roadblocks. I just like to hone in on one: infrastructure. This is a problem throughout the entire continent. We've heard stories about mineral exporters, and there's one thing South Africa should be able to do: it's pull its minerals out of the ground and sell them. Are unable to export in to take full advantage of the opportunities because the rails don't work, the ports are congested, etc., etc., etc. Now, you mentioned an infrastructure build. This is also something which prescient listeners would remember as something the government has been talking about for a long, long time. How would we advocate going about this?
Well, I think the underlying thought is that you make it worth their while for companies and businesses to build and maintain infrastructure. It's not a complicated notion. Sell one of the power stations to a private investor and tell them to fix it and sell electricity, and they get paid for it. So why not? That's a business proposition. Or look at our port infrastructure and our rail infrastructure, where we hear that the mining industry suffered losses. I believe the number was 50 billion rand last year because of delays and obstructions in getting their minerals to destinations. So, it's going to be worth at least 50 billion rand for them to sort that out. And 50 billion rand should be enough of a budget to say, okay, with that kind of money, you can actually defend your railways, fix them, and also sort out the ports. So I think that's the way to do it. You don't have to find the funding within the state. We know how constrained our finances are. Our debt is high. We're blowing out a deficit again this year. So we need to get the private sector in, and you've got to make it worth their while and say, we'll give you a concession, or we'll go on a build, own, operate model for you to run a certain piece of infrastructure. You'll earn money out of it, revenue out of it, fair enough, but at least you're going to keep the thing going. And we can trust the private sector to do this professionally, because if it fails, then somebody else gets a turn. So you make sure that the market punishes the ones who don't perform, and then you get good infrastructure, you get things working, and then we can get the economy growing and jobs being created.
Right. Okay. Well, I think with that we've come to the end. Unless there are any last-minute questions, we at the Institute believe in transparency, accountability, and subjecting ourselves to the slings and arrows of our opponents. Okay, John, thank you very much. I think that we've set out some good ideas, which at the very least should be a spur for people to talk about. And we'd like to thank everyone for coming, and also say please watch the media over the next couple of days and weeks. This will be the topic of a number of opinion pieces, statements, and we hope continuous engagement.
A closing remark, if I may, Terence?
Please.
Which is just the appeal to you as the listeners, the people watching this, as Terence said earlier, to get involved. So in other words, this is a very simple notion that we're selling here. We're saying we've got to have the growth. So in speaking to your friends, neighbors, colleagues, in writing opinion letters, tell people we need one focus, which is to get growth. Anything that is proposed by the government or even one of the opposition parties that's going to move us away from higher growth has to be fought. So get involved in that. And as Terence said, also support the IRR. We're going to make a very strong push on this. We need your support. If you go to our website at irr.org.za and click on the join button, we'll give you a call, and we will very much appreciate your support. Thank you, Terence.
And thank you, John, and thank you to everyone, and we wish you a wonderful day further. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.